There is a place nestled deep in the backwoods of Charleston, South Carolina, where fog clings to the trees like forgotten memories. Locals call it Hollow Ridge Hill, a name whispered with caution, rarely spoken after dark. At the crest of this forgotten slope stands the Whitlock estate, a decaying Victorian mansion left to rot under the southern sun, its windows like watching eyes, its walls swollen with time. For over a century, no one has dared to live there. Children race past its iron gates on dares, and older folks cross the street to avoid its looming shadow. No one truly remembers why. They only know that something lives within that house, something ancient, something patient. But old places hold stories, and the Whitlock house holds more than most. It began, or so people think, with the daughters. 4 of them, born generations apart, different times, different worlds, but the same blood. But what unnerves even the bravest is that they all died young, mysteriously, and always smiling. That same unsettling grin stretching across their pale faces as if death had whispered a secret only they could understand. Before we dive into this chilling tale of family curses and haunting legacies, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping true stories. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. The legend is not just about the deaths, it's about what came before, the strange behavior, the whispered voices, the eerie laugh echoing in the halls at night, and always the same pattern. A young girl from the Whitlock bloodline reaching her late teens, then slowly unraveling until her mind, and eventually her life, slipped away. What haunts people most is the smile, not one of joy or contentment, but one too wide, too forced, unnatural, almost proud. Some say it wasn't a smile at all, but a grimace twisted by whatever took them. The house itself seems to resist the passage of time. The roof sags, the shutters hang loose, and ivy crawls up its spine, yet it still stands tall, defiant. People claim it watches. That when the wind is still and you stand at the gates long enough, you can hear faint music drifting from the upstairs parlor. A piano, long since broken, playing itself, a lullaby from another era. Inside, dust coats the floor in a thick blanket, but no one dares to clean it. The walls are lined with oil portraits, generations of Whitlocks staring down with cold, empty eyes. And at the center of them all the daughters, each framed in a gilded oval, each captured at the peak of her youth. Their names have faded over time, but the smiles remain. Identical. Chilling. Stranger still is the diary. Every time the estate is entered, it reappears. Bound in cracked leather, brittle as old bone, its pages filled with the careful script of a young woman. Yet no 2 entries are ever the same. Those who've dared read from it say the words shift when you're not looking. Some recall confessions, others warnings. One man swears the book spoke to him. He hasn't spoken since. Over the years, families attempted to buy the estate, renovate it, tear it down. But each time the deal falls through. Papers go missing. Contractors walk away. Some vanish entirely. It's as if the house decides who enters and who doesn't leave. Most believe the curse lies within the Whitlock bloodline. Others think the house itself is alive, feeding off sorrow, trapping the spirits of the daughters and reliving their final moments again and again. And then there are those who say the truth is buried deeper, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, in the attic where the air is always cold, no matter the season. But whatever the truth is, it starts here, at the top of Hollow Ridge Hill, with the Whitlock family and their 4 doomed daughters. And so begins the story of Eleanor. Eleanor Whitlock was born in the spring of 1834, under the heavy magnolia trees that surrounded the estate like guardians. From the moment she opened her eyes, the midwife whispered, "She's a Whitlock, no doubt." Her features mirrored those of the women who came before. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin like porcelain, and eyes too wise for someone so young. But it was her smile that unsettled even in infancy. It was serene, practiced, an expression not learned but inherited. Her father, Thomas Whitlock, was a wealthy cotton magnate with a stern gaze and an iron sense of tradition. Her mother, Adelaide, was softer, but often distant, prone to long silences and walks in the orchard, as though chased by thoughts she could not share. Eleanor, their only child, grew up in near solitude, watched by maids and tutors who were paid well to keep her busy and quiet. She rarely left the estate. At 17, Eleanor was already a woman of remarkable intelligence and grace. She read constantly, fluent in Latin and French, and could recite entire poems from memory. But despite her talents, she carried an air of melancholy that followed her like a veil. She would sit for hours in the library, staring at the fire without speaking, as if listening to something just beyond the crackle of the flames. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Eleanor discovered the attic. Drawn by a sound, something like faint humming, she climbed the narrow staircase, the boards groaning beneath her feet. At the far end of the room, tucked beneath a sheet of dust and time, she found an old wooden chest. Inside, among yellowed lace and forgotten trinkets, was a leather-bound journal. The book was delicate, the cover cracked and dry like old skin. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and unfamiliar. There was no name, only dates, some more than a century old, and passages written in poetic, sometimes frantic language. At first the entries were mundane, talk of dresses, of guests, of the changing weather, but as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Whispers, nightmares, shadows that moved where they shouldn't. The same phrase repeated again and again in different ink, different handwriting. "The smile keeps me safe." Eleanor became obsessed. She read the diary each night, sometimes out loud. She began writing her own entries in the margins, answering the thoughts as if they were addressed to her. She no longer dined with her parents. Her voice changed, softer, melodic like the women in the book, and her smile, always gentle before, now lingered too long. It became unnerving, unmoving, as if carved. Adelaide grew concerned. She approached Thomas, asking to send Eleanor away to live with her cousins in Savannah, but Thomas refused. "She's just imaginative," he said, like her grandmother was. The staff, meanwhile, whispered about Eleanor talking to herself, of laughter echoing from her room late at night and the mirror that cracked without cause. One night, Eleanor locked herself in the attic and did not come down until morning. When she appeared at breakfast, she kissed her mother's cheek, smiled wide, and said, "I understand now." She offered no further explanation. From that day on, she wore the same white dress each morning, her hair pinned with a single dried magnolia blossom. Then the dreams began. Adelaide awoke nightly to find Eleanor standing at the foot of her bed, watching in silence. Her eyes would be wide, smile faint. When asked what she was doing, Eleanor would reply, "Listening." Something had changed in her, something irreversible, and yet no one could explain why. Spring faded into summer, and with it, Eleanor's presence seemed to thin. She drifted through the halls like a ghost not yet aware of her death. Her footsteps were light, her voice softer still, her gaze often fixed on nothing. The maids began avoiding her room. They whispered of candles burning out on their own, of music playing when no one was near the parlour, of cold spots that followed Eleanor from one end of the house to the other. Her mother tried to intervene. One morning, Adelaide demanded the attic key. Eleanor handed it over with a smile that did not reach her eyes. But that night, the attic door stood wide open. The key lay untouched on Adelaide's nightstand. From then on, Eleanor no longer needed permission. She began speaking in fragments, words that didn't make sense. "The ink remembers," she once said to the gardener. Another time to the cook, "They all blinked but me." Her journals multiplied, small notebooks hidden in the drawers under her pillow, even tucked between books on the shelf. Each page was filled with strange drawings, eyes without pupils, mouths frozen in wide grins, and symbols no one recognized. The local reverend was called to bless the house. He stayed only 20 minutes. He told Adelaide the house was heavy, and Eleanor's spirit was caught in a net of echoes. He refused to return. At night, Eleanor's laughter filled the halls, not shrill or maniacal, just quiet, rhythmic, like a lullaby gone wrong. The staff began to quit, first the maids, then the cook, then the gardener, who left without collecting his final pay. One by one, they vanished from the estate's life, leaving only Eleanor and her fading parents in the house. Adelaide cried often, Thomas, too proud to show fear, took to sleeping in the downstairs study. Eleanor no longer acknowledged them at meals. She ate in silence, hands folded neatly, head tilted slightly, always with that smile. And whenever Adelaide spoke to her, Eleanor answered with a question, "Do you remember the first voice you ever heard?" Then came the rain. For 3 days, it poured. The estate groaned under the weight of water and time. On the third night, the storm reached its peak. Thunder shattered the sky. Lightning turned the trees into brief skeletons. Adelaide went to check on Eleanor, but her room was empty. The window stood open, curtains dancing like spirits in the wind. Thomas searched the attic. Nothing. They lit lanterns and scoured the house, then the grounds. Then the woods. They called for her until their voices broke. On the 4th day, just as the storm ended, Eleanor was found. She was lying beside the creek at the edge of the property, beneath the twisted willow tree that locals called the Watcher. Her white dress was soaked through, stained with mud and moss. Her hands were folded neatly across her chest. And her face, so peaceful, so still, wore a smile. The coroner found no cause of death, no wounds, no bruises, no water in the lungs. Her body was warm, as if she'd only just slipped away. But the most chilling detail, her lips, though curled in a soft grin, were rigid, fixed, as though she had died mid-laughter, frozen forever in the moment. At the funeral, few attended. The remaining staff refused to return, and the church would not allow the casket inside. She was buried on the estate grounds, beneath the willow tree, in an unmarked grave. Adelaide wept until she collapsed. Thomas stood silent, jaw clenched, unable to speak. They never said her name again. But those who passed the estate swore the attic light would flicker at night. And from time to time a faint melody, like humming, could be heard drifting through the open window, soft and low, almost like a smile turned into song. The Whitlock estate stood still for decades after Eleanor's death, wrapped in silence and shadow. But bloodlines do not vanish with grief. In 1889, the house welcomed a new child, Margaret Whitlock, granddaughter of Thomas and Adelaide, born to their son Jonathan and his northern wife, Isabel. The couple had returned to Holleridge Hill after Jonathan's health failed in New York, seeking quiet and inheritance. Margaret was born during the harvest season beneath a rare red moon. The midwife, old and near blind, said nothing when she first saw the child, only pressed a rosary to her lips and muttered a prayer. From infancy, Margaret was unlike other children. She rarely cried. She would watch the flames in the fireplace for hours, fascinated. Her laughter came only at odd moments, too late, too loud, as if mimicking someone else's emotion. She would often smile in her sleep, her tiny hands twitching as if holding something unseen. Despite her peculiarities, she was loved. Jonathan adored her. Isabel worried, but kept her thoughts to herself. They filled her world with music, books, and tutors. They hoped that intellect would ground her, that education could tame whatever it was that lived quietly in her blood. By the age of 8, Margaret had memorized entire passages from Milton and Blake. She painted vivid, unsettling scenes, trees with twisted mouths, rooms full of faceless people, mirrors that reflected things not in the room. Her teachers were impressed, and yet none stayed long. Something about her unnerved them. Some said she watched them too closely. Others refused to say why they left. The estate had changed too. Doors refused to stay shut. The sound of footsteps echoed where no one walked. The family chalked it up to age, wind, imagination. But Margaret began talking to someone only she could see. She called it the Whisperer. At first, they thought it was harmless, a product of loneliness. But when her drawings began to include a tall, shadowy figure standing just behind her own likeness, always smiling, they grew frightened. One autumn afternoon, Isabel found Margaret standing motionless at the attic door. She was humming a tune that no one recognized. When asked what she was doing, Margaret replied, "I'm waiting to be remembered." She had never been told about Eleanor. That night, Jonathan confronted Isabel. "She knows," he said. "She shouldn't know." They argued. The next day, Isabel burned a stack of old papers in the fireplace, family records, portraits, letters from Adelaide. but Margaret watched the flames with that same unreadable smile. Soon Margaret found the diary. It was tucked in the back of the library, behind a row of dusty encyclopedias. The leather cover was brittle, and the pages smelled of mildew and something older, sweeter, like decay. She opened it without hesitation. Within days, she changed. She began to speak in riddles. At meals, she recited passages no one had taught her. She would sit on the front porch at night staring at the trees, lips curled in a faint smile, whispering to herself. When Isabel tried to take the book from her, Margaret screamed, not in fear but in fury, with a voice deeper than her own. Jonathan had to pry the diary from her hands. That night it disappeared. She withdrew, stopped eating, spoke only in whispers. And always she smiled, never wide, never forced, just present, like she was always on the edge of remembering something sacred and terrible. One evening the house lost power. Candles were lit. The family gathered in the parlor to wait out the outage. Margaret stood beside the grand piano, fingers hovering over the keys. "Do you want to hear what she played?" she asked. No one answered. She began to play. No one had taught her. And yet the melody was hauntingly familiar. Jonathan asked, "Who taught you that?" Margaret didn't look up. She only said, "She's still here." After the piano incident, Margaret rarely spoke aloud. Her voice, once soft and curious, faded into silence. She spent her days in the garden or pacing the halls of the Whitlock estate, with her hands clasped behind her back, as though studying a world invisible to others. She no longer responded to her parents unless directly addressed, and even then only with short, cryptic phrases. Jonathan grew thin and pale. He stopped going into town. Isabel, frantic, invited doctors, spiritualists, and even a traveling mesmerist to examine Margaret. None could explain what was happening. She was physically healthy, calm, composed. Yet they all agreed on one thing. Something was wrong with her eyes. Not the color, not the movement, just the gaze itself, as if Margaret wasn't looking at you, but through you, to someone, or something, behind. Then came the paintings. Margaret began painting obsessively. Dozens of canvases filled the sitting room, each more disturbing than the last. At first they showed vague outlines of the estate, but soon the images turned grotesque. Figures in long white dresses hanging from trees, mouths filled with teeth but no tongues, hands reaching up from beneath the floorboards. In one painting, she had depicted the family dining room as it was, with one difference. Seated at the table, among the living, was a girl with Eleanor's face. No one had shown Margaret any portraits. She painted only at night. Isabel once tried to move her brushes and was met with a cold, sharp whisper from her daughter. "Don't touch what isn't yours." By then, townsfolk had begun avoiding the estate. Word had spread. Children said they heard laughter in the wind near the property, that if you stood by the front gate too long, you'd begin to smile without realizing it. Someone placed a wooden cross near the fence, and by morning it was broken in half, splintered as if bitten. Inside the house, Margaret was fading. She no longer ate meals with her parents. When she did eat, it was alone in the library, always beside the old grandfather clock, always with the diary open in her lap. The diary had returned. No one knew how. Isabel burned it in the fireplace. The next morning, it was on Margaret's pillow. One evening, Jonathan found her in the parlor, sitting motionless in the dark. She was staring at the wall, eyes wide, lips curled slightly. He asked what she was doing. "I'm watching them remember me," she said. Jonathan knelt beside her. "Margaret, there's no one there." She turned to him slowly. "Not yet." That night, Isabel dreamed of a room full of mirrors. In each one, Margaret stood behind her, smiling. When she awoke, her bedroom mirror had cracked down the center. Margaret's final days were quiet. She no longer painted, no longer spoke. She stood by the well behind the estate for hours, unmoving. When Isabel asked her to come inside, she replied, "They drink from this." No one understood what she meant. On the morning of October 3rd, Margaret was gone. No note, no footprints, no sign of struggle. Jonathan searched every inch of the property, the cellar, the attic, even beneath the floorboards. Isabel screamed into the woods until her voice broke. 3 days passed. Then, on the 4th day, the gardener found her. She was floating in the well, her white dress billowing just beneath the surface. Her eyes were closed, her hands rested gently at her sides, and her mouth, soft, still, faint, was curved into a perfect smile. The coroner could not explain it. No injuries. No sign of forced entry or trauma, and no water in her lungs. It was as if she had simply lain down and decided to never rise again. She was 17, and the smile remained. After Margaret's death, the Whitlock estate entered a long period of silence. The shutters stayed closed. The garden overgrew. Jonathan and Isabel vanished from public view, and the house at Holleridge Hill became less a residence and more a rumor, an echo of something the town wished it could forget. But memories, like ghosts, don't leave easily. Whispers started small. Children passing by claimed they saw a girl standing in the attic window, even though the house had been empty for weeks. Others said they heard a piano playing faintly in the evenings. Townsfolk began avoiding the path leading near the estate. Shopkeepers refused to speak the Whitlock name. Even the church removed their family record from its books. The story of the daughters, Eleanor and Margaret, spread quietly, then wildly. Some called it coincidence, others weren't so sure. A few older townspeople remembered Eleanor's strange death decades prior. When placed beside Margaret's, the parallels were too precise. The same age, the same smile, the same inexplicable absence of violence, and always the diary. It was never found after Margaret's burial, but everyone knew it would return. Rumors began to twist. People claimed the Whitlocks were cursed. That long ago, one of their ancestors had wronged something ancient, a spirit, a god, a force unnamed. Some said it dated back to Salem, that a Whitlock matriarch had been accused of witchcraft and escaped judgment through a pact. The smile, they said, was the price, the mark of the pact itself. A grin carved into the bloodline passed on to each daughter like an heirloom. Others believed the curse came from the land, that the estate had been built on sacred ground, a place never meant to house the living. The well where Margaret was found. A gateway, they whispered, a place where voices rose at night and time folded in on itself. One former maid, now old and blind, swore the house had moods, that it sighed in the early morning, that it pulsed in summer heat, that sometimes it felt like it was breathing. She remembered Eleanor, she remembered Margaret, and she warned anyone who listened. The house doesn't take you. It waits for you to give in. But not everyone dismissed the stories as superstition. In 1903, a young journalist named Henry Cross came to Charleston on assignment. He'd heard of the Whitlocks through a cousin who'd grown up near Holleridge Hill. Intrigued by the repetition, by the silence surrounding the deaths, he began asking questions. What he uncovered was unsettling. Medical records for both girls were sealed, then lost. Local officials refused to discuss the investigations. The original coroners had both left town soon after the reports were filed. And every photograph of Margaret taken in the year before her death had been destroyed. Only one remained, an oil portrait hidden in a private gallery, showing her in the white dress, with that smile that no one could forget. Henry interviewed former neighbors, clergy, even a doctor who treated Isabel briefly after Margaret's death. She spoke of echoes, the man said, of hearing her daughter breathe through the walls. The deeper Henry dug, the stranger the story became. He discovered a curious alignment of dates. Eleanor died during a thunderstorm on the 3rd night of heavy rain. Margaret disappeared on the 3rd day after the autumn equinox. Both times the moon had been nearly full. And both times the piano had been heard playing in the night just hours before. Henry's notes filled 2 journals by the time he stopped. He would later write, "I no longer believe in coincidence. I believe in patterns, in history repeating itself when no one listens." But his investigation was only beginning. The Whitlock estate, with its shuttered windows and locked doors, still stood. And inside, waiting beneath dust and memory, was a story that refused to be forgotten. By the turn of the 20th century, the Whitlock name had faded into the mist of Charleston's forgotten nobility. The estate remained untouched, sealed off, held in trust. But bloodlines endure where memory does not. In 1921, Caroline Whitlock was born, daughter of Arthur Whitlock, Jonathan's younger brother, who had relocated to Chicago after the tragedies. Arthur never spoke of the estate. He never mentioned Eleanor or Margaret, but Caroline, sharp and inquisitive, sensed there was more behind the family silence. She grew up surrounded by laughter, jazz, and the rhythm of a modernizing world. Her mother, a lively woman with a voice like a wind chime, tried to fill their home with music and light, but Caroline was drawn to shadows. By 16, she was writing poetry full of eerie imagery, gardens where time stopped, mirrors that held memories not her own, a girl who smiled while everyone else wept. Her teachers called her gifted. Her parents called her sensitive. But Caroline felt something deeper, something pulling. In the summer of 1937, Caroline received a letter from a Charleston lawyer. Her great-aunt Isabel had passed, and Caroline was named heir to the Whitlock estate. Arthur tried to burn the letter, but Caroline retrieved it from the ashes, half-scorched, and read it anyway. She became obsessed. She begged to visit the estate to see where her family had come from. Arthur refused. "That house is not yours," he said. "It never was, and it never should be." When pressed, he told her only one thing: the women don't come back. But Caroline was relentless. That fall she boarded a train south alone. She carried with her a single suitcase, a leather journal, and the smouldering remains of the letter that had awakened something inside her. The estate greeted her like an old friend. Despite its decay, its empty halls, its boarded windows, she felt no fear, only recognition, the kind that lives in the marrow. She walked room to room, breathing in the scent of old wood and dust. The air was thick with silence, but she swore she heard something, footsteps above her, soft humming in the distance. She unpacked in what had once been Eleanor's room. Over the following weeks, Caroline explored the house by day and wrote by night. Her poetry turned darker. She described the walls as watching her, the mirrors as whispering her name. She began painting, though she never had before. She painted faces with twisted smiles, girls with pale skin and hollow eyes. She said they came to her in dreams. The townsfolk noticed her quickly. She was striking, tall, composed, always dressed in dark green. She spoke politely, though distantly, and never lingered. Children crossed themselves when they saw her. Some said she walked without making a sound. Then, as always, the diary returned. It appeared on her nightstand, wrapped in silk. No one could explain how. Caroline, of course, read it. She said nothing to the neighbors, but they began to whisper that she stayed out late, wandering the orchard under moonlight, that her windows flickered with candlelight at odd hours, that sometimes they heard her laughing alone. Inside, she became restless. She paced. She spoke to her reflection. She played the piano even though no one had taught her. The melody was always the same. And then there was the smile. It started subtly, a brief, lingering curl of the lips after a sentence. But soon it became constant. She smiled when she read, when she spoke, even when she wept. The townspeople began to avoid the road past Holleridge Hill. Shopkeepers stopped delivering goods. Letters sent to her went unanswered. It was as if she were disappearing, not physically but inwardly, like a flame burning itself from the inside out. Still, she remained. Whatever she was waiting for, whatever she thought she might find in the silence of those walls, she hadn't yet reached it. But it was coming. Winter crept in with a sharpness that seemed to awaken something inside the house. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and each floorboard groaned under an invisible weight. Caroline no longer left the estate. Her letters home ceased. Her walks became confined to the upper halls where dust collected thick and undisturbed. She spoke aloud to no one, but often answered unheard questions. Her journal entries became erratic, lines repeated dozens of times, words crossed out only to be rewritten in larger script. The phrase, "We're smiling together," began to appear on every page, sometimes written backward, sometimes scribbled along the margins in trembling ink. The staff from town refused to return. One delivery boy claimed he saw her in the window, standing perfectly still, hands at her sides, eyes wide, mouth curved in a smile too large for comfort. When he looked again, she was gone. Then the letters began arriving in town. Notes written in careful, ornate script, unsigned but clearly hers. She addressed them to no one in particular. Phrases like, "We are the same song," and "Her breath is my breath now," frightened even the most rational readers. The local physician, Dr. Harold Eames, took one such note to the authorities. "She needs help," he insisted. Or exorcism. The sheriff visited Holleridge Hill once. He knocked. No answer. As he turned to leave, he heard the piano, a soft, deliberate melody drifting through the floorboards. He later described it as a tune that made my teeth hurt. He never returned. Caroline's collapse was not loud. It came in quiet ruptures. She began speaking to her reflection, calling it by different names, sometimes Eleanor, sometimes Margaret. Once, she whispered, "Adelaide, you never stopped watching me." She scratched the walls of her bedroom with a rusted key, carving circles within circles. She covered the mirror with black cloth. Yet at night, it would always be uncovered again. The house itself responded. The temperature dropped in certain rooms regardless of the weather. Doors slammed without cause. The scent of burning roses lingered in the parlor, even though no fire had been lit in months. Caroline wrote letters to herself. One read, "She says the smile is a door. I understand now." Another, "We were never meant to end, only to echo." By February, she no longer recognized her name. When the postman arrived with a package from Chicago, she signed the receipt as "We." She stopped eating. Her skin grew pale, waxen. The local priest sent a message offering prayer. She returned it unopened with a single word written across the envelope. Later. Eventually, a neighbor, one of the few who dared walk near the grounds, heard something strange one morning. A low chant, rhythmic and steady, rising from the orchard. He followed the sound to the far edge of the property. There, just beneath the willow tree, stood Caroline. She was barefoot in the snow, eyes closed, smiling. He called her name. She opened her eyes and said, "I almost remember," then turned and walked back into the house. Days later, her father arrived unannounced. Arthur Whitlock hadn't seen his daughter in over a year. What he found shook him to his core. She didn't know him. He pleaded with her. Begged. Asked her to come home, to leave the house behind. But she only smiled, touched his cheek and whispered, "There's no home but this one." He arranged for her to be taken to a sanatorium the next morning. She went without protest. In her room at the asylum, she refused to sleep. She stared at the ceiling for hours. When asked why, she said, "They sing when I close my eyes." She wrote on the walls with charcoal, "We're smiling together." And then, "She's almost ready." Henry Cross first heard the name Whitlock in the spring of 1942 while reviewing local folklore cases in the Charleston Historical Society archives. It was an offhand mention, a coroner's journal noting a third occurrence in the lineage beside a yellowed obituary. The line intrigued him. He traced it backward and found the first and second, Eleanor and Margaret. The dates, locations, circumstances, they didn't align in any logical way. But the smiles did. Henry was not a man prone to superstition. A war veteran and seasoned journalist, he'd built a reputation for unraveling mysteries with stubborn reason. But something about the Whitlocks defied clarity. It wasn't just tragedy, it was orchestration, precision, design. He traveled to Charleston and met with archivists, priests, librarians, anyone who would speak. Most didn't. Some whispered warnings. One elderly nun, Sister Agnes, told him plainly, "You're not following a story, you're walking into it." He started at the beginning. He obtained Eleanor's burial record. It had no medical cause of death listed, just the words, "Unexplained cessation." Margaret's file was similar. He requested Caroline's institutional file. The asylum had closed in 1939. The records were in storage. When they arrived, most pages were blank. But in a back room of the Charleston Library, buried beneath irrelevant town council minutes, Henry found what he hadn't expected, a photograph. It showed Caroline at 17, seated at a grand piano inside the estate. Her head was tilted, her hands rested lightly on the keys, and her face her smile, matched Eleanor's portrait exactly. Not similar. Identical. He copied the image and began compiling timelines. Each girl had died, vanished, or collapsed within days of a lunar event. Eleanor during a thunderstorm under a waxing gibbous. Margaret near the autumn equinox. Caroline just after a blood moon. He noted the piano in each case. He noted the diary which appeared in all three lives without explanation. He traced the handwriting. He sent samples to a graphologist in New York. The verdict chilled him. Same writer. All three entries. 3 women, separated by decades, none of whom had known each other, all writing with identical penmanship. He returned to Holleridge Hill, now officially condemned, with a camera and notebook. The house was as silent as the records described, boarded, dust-laden, untouched by time. But as he stepped into the library, something shifted. The floor creaked with rhythm. A chair rocked gently, though no wind moved. He didn't stay long. That night in his hotel room, he reviewed the photographs. In one image of the stairwell mirror, a pale outline stood beside him, just behind his right shoulder. He hadn't seen it in person. The figure was faint, feminine, and most disturbingly, smiling. Henry began to change. He stopped shaving, stopped responding to letters. His editor received rambling notes about ancestral echoes and cyclical grief. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. But Henry wasn't unraveling. He was assembling. He found a clue in a family ledger. A Whitlock ancestor named Hester, born 1674, tried in Salem for witchcraft, but released due to lack of evidence. Her record was struck from court documents. But in a Massachusetts church basement, Henry found a personal letter from a minister who had heard her confession. "I have walked with her kind before," it read. "She names things that should not be named." He returned to Charleston with one purpose: to publish. He titled his manuscript The Whitlock Daughters, a study in inherited madness and patterned demise. But no publisher would touch it. One editor refused to even keep the manuscript in his office. "The words feel alive," he said. "They watch." Henry rewrote the ending 7 times, then stopped writing altogether. His final note, scribbled on the back of a photo of Caroline, read, "If they smile through death, maybe it isn't death at all." 3 days later, he disappeared. Elizabeth Whitlock was born on a quiet Sunday in 1941, during the height of the war. Her mother died 2 days later. Her father, a man already stretched thin by grief and whiskey, left her in the care of an aunt, a distant relative who refused to utter the family name. Elizabeth grew up hearing that the past was poison, that some names should never be spoken, and some places never returned to. But when she turned 18, a letter arrived. The Whitlock estate, long dormant, had transferred to her by default. There were no more heirs. The name had narrowed, generation by generation, until it reached her. The letter was formal, legal, and final. Elizabeth, curious and burdened by nothing but debts and silence, accepted. In April of 1959, she arrived at Holleridge Hill. The house had changed little, despite decades of abandonment. Its roof bowed slightly, its windows cloudy with time. Vines had claimed the eastern wing, and the gate hung crooked. But the structure stood as though waiting. She stepped inside and felt nothing unusual. No voices, no sudden cold, just stillness, and a strange, overwhelming familiarity, like opening a book she'd never read but already knew by heart. She began cleaning. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth was practical. She didn't speak to shadows or wander aimlessly. She made repairs, she cooked. She laughed to herself when floorboards groaned and old portraits tilted slightly overnight. She told the house aloud, "You don't scare me." But then came the dreams. She would wake, gasping, heart racing, her bedsheets soaked in sweat. The dreams always started the same, walking down a long hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different girl, all with her face. Some wept, some screamed, but all of them smiled in the end. She told herself it was stress. She found the diary in the 3rd week. It was resting on the attic window ledge, covered in a thin layer of dust. She flipped it open and saw her name on the inside cover, written in a script she did not recognize. The entries made no sense. half poems, fragmented memories, all written in the first person. One entry simply read, "She's arrived." She locked the diary away in a trunk. It returned to her nightstand the next morning. She tried to leave the house that day, packed a bag. Drove to the edge of Charleston, but when she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw the house, impossibly, just behind her. She passed out on the side of the road and awoke hours later with no memory of turning back. But her car was parked neatly in the estate's driveway. Elizabeth began to change. She no longer listened to the radio. The sound of static made her uneasy. She covered all the mirrors in the house, then removed the coverings days later, saying, "They like to see." Her sleep became intermittent. She often sat in the upstairs hallway, humming lullabies she swore she never learned. Her voice would rise in pitch, break, and fall silent as she stared at the wall for hours. Neighbors noticed lights flickering at strange hours. One postman claimed he heard a piano playing when he passed the house at dawn. Another saw Elizabeth digging in the orchard with bare hands, but she still smiled, always softly, always as if someone had just told her a secret. In August, she began recording herself. Short clips, no introductions. Just her voice speaking into the microphone. "I've met them. They're not lost. I can feel the others." The recordings grew more erratic. One ended with a whisper not her own. Another captured only breathing, long and steady, until the tape ran out. She stopped answering the door, stopped buying food. No one saw her for weeks, but the smile remained. And the diary, now open, its pages fluttering through the air, was still, waited quietly on her pillow. September arrived with oppressive stillness. The leaves around Holleridge Hill curled early, dry and brittle before their time. Elizabeth spoke to no one. Her phone line went dead, her mail piled at the gate. The estate was now a world unto itself, sealed, pulsing with secrets. Elizabeth spent her days in the library, surrounded by candles, speaking into a handheld recorder. The tapes, recovered years later, captured fragments, not thoughts, confessions. "They asked me to remember. I said I already do. I dream in mirrors now. Every voice I've ever heard is still inside me. None of them are mine." She stopped sleeping altogether. She'd pace through the halls at night, humming softly, barefoot, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her reflection no longer mimicked her movements. Sometimes it smiled when she didn't. Sometimes it looked away before she did. Neighbors who ventured close swore they saw her standing in the orchard, surrounded by birds that didn't move. Others claimed she was digging again with both hands, her mouth open as if in song, though no sound emerged. One boy approached the gate on a dare and ran screaming, convinced he'd seen 3 of her, watching from different windows. Then came the markings. She painted symbols on the walls, circles bound in spirals, with tiny eyes and teeth along their edges. In the kitchen, she carved a phrase repeatedly into the wooden table. "We were never meant to be separate." In her bedroom, she drew faces, each one identical, each one hers, all of them smiling. She referred to herself in the plural. In one recording, she stated clearly, "We're not Elizabeth anymore. Elizabeth was just the last verse." The song plays through her now, and then, "We are ready." She stopped eating. Her frame grew thin, but she moved with a strange grace, as though something steadied her limbs from within. Her nails lengthened, her eyes darkened beneath. She whispered names no one could trace, Eleanor, Margaret, Caroline, then names older still. At night, music returned to the house. Neighbors swore they heard a piano, though no one had restored it. The same tune again and again, sometimes soft like a lullaby, sometimes distorted, too fast, too slow, as if time inside was bending to the melody. The orchard withered, grass turned black around the well. Trees dropped their fruit early, rotten and full of wriggling things. Birds stopped nesting there. Insects buzzed around the estate, but refused to cross its threshold. It was as though the house had declared its own perimeter. Then, on October 3rd, Elizabeth vanished. Her bed was made. Her boots remained by the door. A fire had burned low in the hearth, and her tape recorder sat still on the desk, blinking red. The final recording lasted 17 seconds. a soft hum, a low exhale. And then, I am next. Search parties formed. Volunteers scoured the orchard, the cellar, the attic. They drained the well. Nothing, no footprints, no struggle, just silence. On the third morning, she was found. Sitting upright in the library chair, her eyes were closed, her hands rested gently on the open diary, and her mouth curled in a soft, familiar smile. There were no signs of violence. No wounds, no toxins, no trauma, but the air in the room was thick, hard to breathe, as though the space had been holding something that had only just left or only just arrived. When they tried to move her, they found her body cold, but not stiff, as if she had only just taken her last breath. And the recorder. It played once more, without anyone pressing the button. A whisper, barely audible. Now she remembers. Elizabeth Whitlock was 20 years old. She was the last. And yet somehow not alone. The discovery of Elizabeth's body sent ripples through Charleston, but what followed would unnerve even the most skeptical. Her corpse, once recovered and documented by local authorities, was placed in the county morgue. A full autopsy was scheduled. Her family, or what little remained, was notified. Arrangements were made for burial in a private cemetery, but when the coroner arrived 2 days later, her body was gone. No sign of tampering, no forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. The sheet she'd been covered with lay folded neatly atop the slab. And on the wall, written in something not quite ink, not quite ash, were 3 words. She walked home. The sheriff ordered a full investigation. Interviews, fingerprints, overnight surveillance of the estate. Every angle examined, no answers. And though the news never made front pages, whispers spread quickly, especially among those who knew the house's legacy. The search resumed. They returned to Holleridge Hill, expecting signs of ritual or intrusion. Instead, they found something worse, normalcy. The house looked untouched, no mess, no vandalism. The diary was gone, as were the tapes, the recordings, the paintings. Elizabeth's clothes were folded in drawers. Her bed was made. On the library desk where she'd been found sat a single handwritten page. To live once is a gift. To remember it again is the price. And beneath that, a symbol. 3 concentric circles, 4 curved smiles. The investigators were shaken. The sheriff refused to enter the house a second time. He left a deputy posted outside for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, the deputy was gone. His cruiser sat idling by the gate, radio on, door open, his gun untouched. And on the hood of the car, a white magnolia blossom, the same flower Eleanor once wore in her hair. The case was closed, officially listed as unresolved disappearance following natural death. No explanation, no follow-up. The house was declared off limits, trespassing signs posted, but none were enforced. No one wanted to be responsible for it, but some, driven by morbid curiosity or unsilenced fear, continued watching. One young man, a college student obsessed with the legend, claimed to have seen Elizabeth through the upstairs window weeks after her death, sitting in the library, writing. He took a photograph with a cheap camera. When developed, it showed a darkened room. But the faint outline of a figure was visible, and that same impossible smile. Another man, a groundskeeper hired to trim the front hedges, vanished during his shift. His shears were found stuck into the trunk of the willow tree, sunk too deep to remove by hand. The town stopped talking about the Whitlocks, stopped asking questions, stopped responding to interviews or letters. Holleridge Hill became a ghost story, one told to children, if at all, as a warning. But even then, the details blurred. They say she smiled herself out of life, some whispered. They say the house called her back. They say she's not gone, just rewritten. Years passed, but one thing never changed. The house remained, its windows still watched, its doors still stood closed. And at night, if you stood far enough from the road to see the second-floor window, you might catch a glimpse of the library. And if you're unlucky or unwise, you might see her, seated, upright, with her head tilted, and her smile still blooming. But the most disturbing detail wasn't her expression. It was the diary. open once again in her lap, its pages fluttering softly as if moved by breath. And on the final page, written in steady, careful script, "She's not the last." Henry Cross had not been seen in over a year when his manuscript surfaced. A package arrived at the office of Harper & Branson Publishing in New York. No return address, just a battered leather envelope tied with twine. Inside, a handwritten manuscript titled The Whitlock Daughters, along with a brief note. "Publish if you dare, but don't read it out loud." The editor, curious but skeptical, flipped through the pages. What he found wasn't a novel, it wasn't memoir, it wasn't journalism. It was something else entirely. A record, a testimony, a detailed, relentless account of the Whitlock lineage, from Eleanor to Elizabeth, each section written with obsessive clarity. Photographs were included, some familiar, others entirely unknown. Newspaper clippings, obituaries, personal letters, and excerpts from a diary transcribed word for word. At first, the publisher thought it was a hoax, a clever piece of horror fiction, but when he tried to confirm Henry's whereabouts, he hit walls. No recent activity, no new work. His apartment was empty, rent unpaid. Neighbors hadn't seen him. His last phone call had been to Charleston, and even then no one knew who he spoke to. The company hesitated, but eventually curiosity overcame caution. They printed a small run. It sold out in a week. The response was electric. Some readers were entranced, others disturbed. One reviewer wrote, "It feels like reading someone else's hallucination, only to realize it's your own memory." Another described having vivid dreams, always of a girl in white, always smiling. Within months, the Whitlock Daughters developed a cult following. Forums dissected its content. Academics debated its historical authenticity. Paranormal researchers cited it as a document of unique spiritual patterning, and readers began to report strange occurrences, copies that refused to stay shelved, margins where new phrases appeared in faded ink, and in one terrifying case, a woman in Illinois claimed the book began humming when left open at night. Despite the noise, the publisher couldn't capitalize further. The second shipment of copies went missing in transit. The warehouse manager vanished. The printing press reported errors in the type, letters shifting on their own, pages printed backward. One editor quit after saying she saw her own face in one of the book's old photographs. Rumors spread that the manuscript itself changed depending on who read it. Some said it revealed only certain daughters. Others claimed entire chapters were missing or rearranged, but every version ended the same way. Elizabeth smiling in the library, with the diary in her lap, and the words, "She's not the last." Then the calls began, readers reporting voices when reading aloud, readers dreaming of mirrors, readers writing in journals they didn't own. The publisher received a cease and desist from a group of Charleston residents who accused the company of summoning what should stay buried, but the book wouldn't stop. Illicit copies circulated, handwritten transcriptions, audio recordings. Some said the story wanted to be told. Others believed it was being told again because it was never finished. As for Henry, no one ever found him. His name was quietly added to a missing persons list in Charleston, dated April 4, 1960. His last confirmed appearance was at a train station, purchasing a one-way ticket to a location he never reached. In his old apartment, only one item remained, a chair. Worn, wooden, placed in the center of the room facing the door. The cushion was warm when they found it. And though the room was sealed and still, the chair was spinning slowly, gently, just enough to be seen. A note was taped beneath the seat. It read, "Some stories don't end, they wait." And below that, drawn faintly in pencil, 4 identical smiles. By 1965, the Whitlock estate had become more myth than memory. Overgrown, boarded, and legally entangled, it sat untouched for nearly 6 years. Nature crept over its edges, vines clutching its columns, weeds overtaking the orchard. Locals no longer walked past it. Children didn't speak of it. The house had become a hollow monument, unseen, but never forgotten. Until someone bought it. A family from Ohio, unaware of its history, purchased the estate at auction. The father, an academic seeking solitude, believed the South offered peace and space. His wife dreamed of restoration, of reviving a house with character, and their daughters, 4 of them, ages 6 to 13, saw only adventure. No one stopped them. No one warned them, not because they didn't care, but because no one wanted to be part of it again. The sale went through with unnatural ease. The papers signed without incident. The property cleared of back taxes by unknown parties. Keys delivered in a blank envelope. No sender, no return address. The lawyer involved retired that same month and moved overseas. The family arrived in late spring. At first, all seemed well. The girls explored the grounds, climbed the willow tree, played hide-and-seek between the columns. The parents painted, scrubbed, and praised the house's bones. They found it structurally sound, dry despite its age, untouched by rot. A miracle, they called it. Then the oddities began. The youngest daughter, Annie, found a book in the attic. She brought it down to the dining room, proud of her discovery. Her mother opened it. There were no words. Just pages and pages of soft grey smiles, sketched over and over. The book vanished that night. They blamed the dog. The second daughter, Lila, began sleepwalking. She stood in the hallway, whispering names that didn't belong to anyone they knew. When asked what she was doing, she said, "Listening to the others." The third, June, claimed her reflection blinked before she did. She laughed as she said it, but didn't laugh again after. And the eldest, Nora, started smiling in her sleep. A strange, stretched grin that her parents noticed but never spoke of. They told themselves it was normal, growing pains, imagination, children adjusting to a new home. But the piano played, late at night. Always the same song, always from the library. The father dismissed it as settling wood, old pipes wind through cracked glass. But one night, unable to sleep, he crept downstairs and opened the library door. The piano was still, but the keys were warm, and on the bench a single sheet of paper. "We remember." He burned it in the fireplace. The next day it reappeared, pinned to the attic door. The girls began to change. They sat together in silence more often. Their games grew stranger. Their laughter came in unison. When asked separately what they dreamed of, they answered the same. She told us her name. The mother found sketches beneath their pillows, smiling faces, 4 of them, each wearing a different shade of white. The orchard rotted. Fruit turned to mush before ripening. The grass refused to grow. The well, once dry, bubbled softly at night, though no rain had fallen. The family still refused to leave. Not because they didn't notice, but because they forgot why they ever would. Neighbors who drove past noticed something else. The lights no longer flickered. They glowed, evenly, warmly, like someone was always home. And the girls? They stood by the window sometimes, all 4, side by side. Dressed in white, not moving, not waving, just watching. With smiles, not cruel, not joyful, just knowing. And somewhere inside, the diary had returned, not found, not claimed, just waiting. Time passed. The new family remained. Their names faded from town records, replaced by silence. Letters returned unopened, phone lines disconnected. But the house stood brighter than ever, curtains drawn back, windows polished, gardens trimmed, as if it had never known sorrow. But those who dared glance up at Holleridge Hill knew otherwise, because the smiles never stopped. Each season brought whispers, hikers hearing laughter where there was none. Travelers swearing they saw 4 girls dressed alike, walking hand in hand toward the woods, then vanishing behind the trees. And always, always the smile, serene, still, strangely comforting in its impossibility. No tragedy was ever officially recorded, no obituary filed, no emergency calls logged. But people stopped buying land near Holleridge Hill, stopped building, stopped asking. And yet the legend grew, because stories that aren't told properly find ways to repeat themselves. Some say the house chooses, others say it waits. But one thing is certain. Every few decades a letter arrives for someone who's never heard the name Whitlock before. Always from a lawyer, always bearing keys to a house they never knew they inherited, and always addressed to a woman, never a man. Always 4 daughters, always one smile. Inside the house, the library remains untouched. The piano stands ready, tuned by unseen hands. The fireplace never collects dust, and in the upstairs bedroom, whether for Eleanor, Margaret, Caroline, or Elizabeth, the mirror still watches, and reflects only those who are meant to be there. The diary, too, remains, not on a shelf, but within. It waits behind words not yet written, inside voices not yet spoken. It waits in ink that dries before the pen moves. It waits in memories that aren't yours, until suddenly they are. And when the next girl arrives, she won't need to be told what to do. She'll remember. The pattern is perfect. The ending, inevitable. The music plays. The others listen. And together they smile. Not out of fear. Not from joy. But because something old has finally made room for them again. The Whitlock legacy was never about death. It was about reunion, a chorus in harmony, a design completed. And now you know it too. You've heard their names, felt the rhythm, listened to the silence, and smiled, just a little, without knowing why. So if you've come this far, maybe you were meant to. Maybe the house wanted you to remember. Maybe it still has something left to tell, but whatever you do, don't ignore the next letter. Don't toss it in the fire or bury it in a drawer. Because if it has your name, it already knows your voice, and it's been waiting to hear you sing. If you enjoyed this harrowing tale of haunting bloodlines and impossible echoes, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true horror stories, cursed histories, and unsolved mysteries. Your subscription helps us continue to uncover the truths that others try to forget. And who knows, maybe the next story will be yours. Click the video on your screen now to discover another terrifying legacy, the most cursed family in New England, whose blood runs colder than the grave. And remember, some smiles are earned, others are inherited.